Walking into the Grand Azure Hotel's luxurious lobby, I savored the irony of the moment. My ex-husband Derek was about to discover that his new job as a maintenance worker put him directly under my employment, though he didn't know it yet. The same man who left me for his secretary and told me I'd never amount to more than a glorified hostess was about to learn that I now owned the five-star hotel where he desperately needed work after his company's spectacular collapse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As he waited in the employee lounge, filling out his final paperwork, I suppressed a smile. The staff assignment documents in my portfolio were about to change everything. The Italian marble floors of the Grand Azure echoed under my heels as I made my way toward the service department offices. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you. And don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow I've got something extra special lined up for you. 4 years had transformed me from Sophia Conway, the restaurant manager Derek had belittled and discarded, into Sophia Miller, CEO of Elevate Hospitality Group, one of the coast's fastest-growing luxury hotel chains. Most employees knew me only through my executive team or quarterly video messages, a management approach that had served me well, especially for this carefully orchestrated moment. Through the frosted glass walls, I could see Derek hunched over, his paperwork, probably wondering how his life had taken such a dramatic turn. He hadn't changed much, same rigid posture, same meticulously groomed hair now threaded with gray, same habit of checking his watch every few minutes. The only difference was the desperation that now clung to him like cheap cologne. The door opened smoothly under my touch. "Good morning," I said, watching Derek's eyes flick up and then back down to his papers without really seeing me. 4 years, a completely different style, and his own self-absorption worked perfectly in my favor. "I'm here to finalize your onboarding with Elevate Hospitality," I said, setting my leather portfolio on the table. "About time?" Derek huffed, glancing at his watch. "I was told this would only take an hour. I've already been waiting 40 minutes. "I apologize for any inconvenience," I replied smoothly, taking the seat across from him. "The hiring process for the Grand Azure is quite thorough. We maintain exacting standards." He continued filling out the forms without looking up. "Well, I expect this won't take long. I was assured this position was just temporary until something more appropriate becomes available. My background is in corporate finance, not maintenance." I opened my portfolio, extracting his employment file. "Yes, I see that noted here. However, all new maintenance staff begin with the same training regimen regardless of background." Madison, my chief operating officer, entered quietly and took the seat beside me. She'd been instrumental in the acquisition of the Grand Azure 6 months ago and knew exactly who Derek was. Her presence was both support and witness to what would unfold. Derek finally looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "Look, I appreciate the opportunity, but surely there's been some miscommunication. With my executive experience at Pinnacle Investments, I should be considered for at least a management position. This maintenance job was presented as a temporary stepping stone." I let him talk, studying the man who had once been the center of my universe. 11 years of marriage had ended with a text message of all things, while I was caring for my father after his stroke. Things have changed. Melanie understands my ambitions. You never will. Divorce papers coming tomorrow. That was the moment that had broken me and then rebuilt me into something stronger. While Derek flaunted his affair with Melanie, his executive assistant, across social media, I'd quietly enrolled in an advanced hospitality management program. While he expanded Pinnacle investments into risky markets, I'd learned the intricacies of luxury hotel operations and property acquisition. While he built his house of cards, I'd been constructing something with a foundation of granite. "Your training begins tomorrow at 5:30 a.m., I interrupted, sliding his schedule across the table. "You'll report to Raymond in housekeeping first. The initial 2 weeks will focus on all aspects of hotel maintenance, including restroom sanitation and upkeep." Derek's face flushed red. "Restroom sanitation? You mean cleaning toilets? This is absurd. I was a chief financial officer." "Yes, at Pinnacle Investments," I replied evenly. "However, given the circumstances of the company's collapse and the ongoing federal investigation, I'm sure you understand our caution with immediate management placements." Derek's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The spectacular implosion of Pinnacle Investments 3 months ago had been front-page news, with accusations of financial mismanagement and questionable accounting practices. Derek had avoided criminal charges, unlike some of his colleagues, but his reputation was in tatters, and his assets had been frozen during the investigation. "The Grand Azure believes in giving people second chances," I continued, "but trust must be earned. All employees start with the fundamentals of hospitality service." "And how long am I expected to clean toilets before moving to a more suitable position?" he asked through clenched teeth. I closed his file deliberately. "That depends entirely on your performance, adaptability, and attitude. Some advance quite quickly, others less so." Madison slid the employee handbook toward him. "All evaluation metrics are outlined here. The Grand Azure has a clearly defined advancement pathway." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Derek reluctantly took the handbook, his fingers drumming an agitated rhythm on the table. "Fine, for now. But I expect to be re-evaluated for an appropriate position within a month. Your first performance review will be in 90 days, I corrected him. "Now, if you'll just sign these final forms, we can complete your onboarding." As Derek scrawled his signature, I savored the perfect symmetry of the moment. 4 years ago, he'd signed divorce papers that left me with barely enough to cover 3 months' rent, claiming I'd contributed nothing of value to our marriage. Now, he was signing employment papers that placed him at the absolute bottom of my corporate hierarchy. "One last thing," I said, handing him his employee ID card and uniform voucher. "All maintenance staff report directly to the executive housekeeper, who reports to hotel operations, who reports to our COO, Madison, here." "And who's at the top?" Derek asked distractedly, examining his ID card with distaste. "That would be our CEO and owner," Madison replied with a small smile. "Some corporate hospitality conglomerate, I assume?" Derek tucked the ID into his pocket without interest. "Actually," I said, standing up and extending my hand, "Elevate Hospitality. Group is privately owned. I'm Sophia Miller, CEO and founder. Welcome to the Grand Azure, Derek." His head snapped up, eyes suddenly focusing on my face with dawning recognition. The color drained from his expression as 11 years of marriage flashed behind his eyes, now seeing past the elegant suit, the confident posture, and the changed surname. "Sophia?" His voice cracked slightly. "This is... you own?" "The Grand Azure Hotel, yes, along with 6 other properties along the coast," I confirmed, watching the realization sink in. "I trust you'll find your role here educational." Derek sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a beached fish. "Your uniform can be collected from staff services on the lower level," I continued professionally. "Raymond expects All new team members to arrive 15 minutes early on their first day, so that's 5:15 a.m. tomorrow. Punctuality is highly valued at the Grand Azure. With that, I gathered my portfolio and turned to leave. Madison followed, closing the door behind us. Through the glass, I could see Derek still sitting there, staring at his employee badge as though it might bite him. "You realize he's going to quit," Madison said quietly as we walked toward the executive elevator. "Perhaps," I replied, pressing the button for the penthouse offices. "But his assets are frozen, his reputation is destroyed, and his resume now has a glaring red flag for any potential employer. Besides, the Grand Azure pays better than anywhere else in the city, even for maintenance staff. He needs this job more than he needs his pride." As the elevator doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of Derek through the frosted glass, shoulders slumped in defeat. The journey that had brought us both to this moment had been long and painful, but as the elevator rose toward my executive suite, I felt only the satisfaction of a long game beautifully played. This story begins 4 years ago, but its roots stretch back even further. Derek and I met in college. He was studying finance, and I was in the hospitality program. We fell in love over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of creating something meaningful in the world. Derek would lead a financial empire, and I would revolutionize the hospitality industry. We were young, ambitious, and unstoppable together. Or so I thought. After graduation, reality set in quickly. Derek landed a prestigious entry-level position at Pinnacle Investments, while I took a job managing a mid-tier restaurant to gain practical experience. Just temporary, I told myself, believing that our shared success was just a matter of time and hard work. As Derek climbed the corporate ladder, our life began to revolve entirely around his career. I put my own ambitions on hold, supporting him through late nights, hosting dinner parties for his colleagues, and moving 3 times for his promotions. Each move meant starting over for me. New jobs, always lateral, never advancing my own dreams. When Derek was promoted to CFO at 33, I suggested it might be time for me to pursue my own career goals more seriously. I'd created a business, planned for a boutique hotel concept, something intimate and unique that could grow into something larger. "A hotel?" Derek had laughed, skimming my carefully researched proposal. "Do you have any idea how much capital that requires? How competitive the industry is? This is cute, Sophia, but stick to what you're good at. Being charming at dinner parties and managing that little restaurant." That little restaurant was generating record profits under my management, but Derek dismissed it as a hobby, not a career. Still, I persisted, taking night courses in business management and hospitality operations, building connections in the industry, and refining my concept. Then came the day that changed everything. My father suffered a severe stroke, and I rushed to be with him in the hospital. For 3 days, I sat by his bedside, coordinating with doctors and supporting my mother. On the evening of the 3rd day, as Dad finally stabilized, my phone buzzed with a message from Derek. "Things have changed. Melanie understands my ambitions. You never will. Divorce papers coming tomorrow." 11 years of marriage ended in a text message while I was holding my father's hand in a hospital room. The timing was classic Derek. He'd waited until I was emotionally vulnerable and physically absent, unable to confront him face to face. By the time I returned home a week later, Derek had moved out and into Melanie's downtown apartment. The divorce was swift and brutal. Derek's high-priced lawyers painted me as a spouse who had contributed nothing to his success. Mrs. Conway was uninvolved in any financial decisions or career-building activities, they argued. She chose to remain in food service rather than advancing her education or professional standing. The fact that I had supported his career at the expense of my own had moved multiple times, disrupting any professional momentum I might have built, meant nothing in the cold calculus of the divorce proceedings. In the end, I received a settlement that would cover expenses for a few months, while Derek kept the house, the investments, and the future we had planned together. "You never really understood how the real world works, Soph," he said during our final mediation session, using the nickname I'd once loved. "Melanie's different. She sees the bigger picture." His executive assistant sat beside him, her hand possessively on his arm, the diamond ring on her finger catching the light. I later learned he'd bought it with funds from our joint account, before filing for divorce. Many would have been broken by such betrayal, and for a time, I was. But Derek had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated me entirely. During our marriage, I'd absorbed every conversation about business operations and investment strategies. I'd built relationships with the wealthy clientele who frequented my restaurant, listening as they discussed real estate deals and hospitality ventures. While Derek saw my career as insignificant, I had been learning, observing, and planning. The modest divorce settlement became seed capital for what would follow. I moved in with my recovering father and mother, helping care for Dad, while slashing my living expenses to nearly nothing. Every dollar saved went into my emerging business plan. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to my journey from betrayal to success. The first piece of luck came from an unexpected quarter. Victor Chen, a regular customer at my restaurant and a successful real estate developer, had always praised my management style and attention to detail. When he heard about my situation, the restaurant gossip network was surprisingly efficient. He requested a meeting. "I've been watching how you transformed that struggling restaurant," he said over coffee. "You have a gift for hospitality and operational excellence. I'm looking for someone to manage a small inn I've acquired as an investment property. It needs a complete overhaul in operations and concept. Interested?" The property was a struggling 15-room inn on the outskirts of town. Nothing glamorous, but it was an opportunity with significant autonomy. The salary was modest, but it came with a critical benefit: a small ownership stake that would increase based on performance metrics. "I don't want just a manager," Victor explained. "I want a partner who'll treat this place like they own it, because they actually will, partly, at least." I took the job and threw myself into the transformation. Working 18-hour days, I reimagined every aspect of the property, from service protocols to marketing strategy. I lived on site in a tiny manager's apartment, pouring every dollar of my salary back into carefully calculated improvements. Within a year, the occupancy rate had doubled, and profit margins had tripled. The Lakeside Inn became known for exceptional service and atmosphere, despite its modest accommodations. Victor was impressed enough to increase my ownership stake to 25% and provide access to his network of investors. "You've got something special, Sophia," he told me. "You understand that hospitality isn't just about a nice room or good service. It's about creating an experience that makes people feel valued." Meanwhile, Derek's career continued its upward trajectory. Pinnacle Investments was expanding aggressively, and as CFO, Derek was featured in business publications touting their innovative financial strategies. He and Melanie, now his wife, became fixtures in the society pages, hosting lavish parties in the house that had once been ours. I avoided social media during this time, focusing entirely on building my future rather than watching his highlight reel. But occasionally, news of his success would reach me through mutual acquaintances. Each mention was a small barb, but also fuel for my determination. The second year brought another opportunity. A small 30-room boutique hotel in financial distress came on the market. With Victor's backing and the track record I'd established, we secured financing to acquire the property. This became the first official Elevate Hospitality property, though the name and brand identity would come later. The transformation of this property proved even more dramatic than the inn. I recruited Jessica Lynn, a brilliant hospitality school graduate who was being overlooked at a corporate chain hotel, as my operations manager. Together, we reimagined the property as Azure Bay Inn, creating a coastal luxury experience at accessible price points. Most hotel groups start at the top end of the market or the bottom, I explained to our small but growing team. We're going to start in the middle and perfect the art of delivering 5-star experiences at 3-star prices. The concept resonated powerfully. Within 18 months, Azure Bay Inn was operating at 92% occupancy year-round in an industry where 70% was considered excellent. The property began generating the capital needed for further expansion. During this period, I legally changed my surname from Conway back to my maiden name, Miller. It wasn't just about removing Derek's name. It was about reclaiming my identity and marking the beginning of a new chapter. Victor introduced me to Eliza Washington, a formidable investment banker looking to diversify her portfolio into hospitality. She visited Azure Bay Inn incognito as a guest before meeting with me officially. "I've stayed at hotels all over the world," she said during our first meeting. "What you've created here delivers something most 5-star properties miss: authentic, care embedded in every interaction. That's something you can't fake with expensive furnishings." With Eliza's investment, Elevate Hospitality Group was formally established. We acquired 2 more struggling properties over the next 18 months, transforming them with the same approach that had worked so well at Azure Bay. Each property maintained its unique character while delivering the consistent excellence that was becoming our hallmark. Madison Green joined us from a major luxury hotel chain, bringing corporate experience that complemented my entrepreneurial approach. Together, we formalized the systems and training protocols that would allow us to scale without losing quality. Most hotel groups expand too quickly and dilute their brand promise, Madison observed. We need to grow at a pace that allows our culture to take root at each new property. 3 years after Derek's devastating text message, Elevate Hospitality Group owned 4 successful hotel properties and was generating significant industry attention. I had moved beyond survival mode into genuine success, yet still operated largely behind the scenes, letting our properties and team members take the spotlight. The opportunity that would lead to my most satisfying triumph appeared unexpectedly during a routine investment review. A magnificent historic hotel in the heart of downtown, the Grand Azure, was quietly being offered for sale. The current owners, an aging couple ready to retire, wanted to ensure their beloved property would be in good hands. The Grand Azure was no ordinary hotel. With 200 rooms, 3 restaurants, and a storied history hosting celebrities and dignitaries, it was the crown jewel of the city's hospitality landscape. It was also where Derek and I had spent our honeymoon 11 years earlier, a detail that added a layer of poetic justice to the possibility. "This is several steps above our current properties," Madison cautioned when I mentioned my interest. "The capital requirements alone would stretch us to the limit. Sometimes you have to reach beyond your grasp to grow," I replied, already envisioning what the Grand Azure could become under our management. The acquisition process was complex and demanding. The owners entertained multiple offers, including several from international hotel conglomerates with vastly deeper pockets than Elevate Hospitality. What we lacked in financial firepower, we made up for in vision and personal commitment. I spent weeks researching the hotel's history, understanding its place in the community, and creating a revitalization plan that honored its heritage while bringing it firmly into the present. When I presented this vision to the owners in a private dinner at their residence, I spoke not just as a potential buyer but as someone who would be a steward of their legacy. The corporations want to buy your building, I told them. I want to continue your story. 2 months of tense negotiations followed, but in the end, the owners chose Elevate Hospitality's offer, despite it not being the highest bid. You understand. What makes the Grand Azure special, they explained. That's worth more than a few extra million to us. The acquisition stretched our resources to the breaking point, requiring new investors and creative financing. The business press questioned the wisdom of a relatively new hospitality group taking on such an ambitious property. Industry veterans predicted we would struggle to maintain the Grand Azure's standards. The transformation began immediately. While respecting the hotel's heritage and retaining its loyal staff, we implemented the operational excellence and service philosophy that had become Elevate's hallmark. I temporarily moved into the hotel, working alongside team members in every department to understand the challenges and opportunities. 6 months of intensive work culminated in a grand reopening celebration that garnered significant media attention. The Grand Azure was once again the centerpiece of the city's hospitality scene, now with a refreshed identity and renewed purpose. Throughout this period, I remained largely out of the public eye, letting our executive team represent Elevate, hospitality and media appearances. My focus was on building and strengthening the operation itself, not on personal recognition. Then came the news that would set the stage for the most unexpected reunion. Pinnacle Investments, Derek's company, collapsed virtually overnight amid allegations of accounting irregularities and mismanagement of client funds. As CFO, Derek was at the center of the storm, though initial reports suggested he might avoid criminal charges unlike the CEO and several other executives. The same business publications that had once featured Derek's success stories now detailed his downfall. Photos showed him leaving federal buildings, ashen-faced and refusing to comment. His assets were frozen pending investigation, and rumors circulated that Melanie had filed for separation. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall. That kind of schadenfreude would have been beneath the person I had become. But I did recognize an opportunity to close a chapter that had been left unfinished. When his application for a maintenance position at the Grand Azure crossed my desk 3 weeks later, I knew the universe had a sense of humor after all. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had once dismissed my hospitality ambitions was now seeking employment at my flagship property. His resume had been heavily sanitized, listing his experience as financial executive, without naming Pinnacle Investments, but our HR team had flagged the connection immediately. Policy would have typically rejected his application outright due to the ongoing investigation, but I intervened personally. Some might call it revenge to hire him for the lowest position possible, knowing he would eventually discover who owned the Grand Azure. I preferred to think of it as an opportunity for education. Derek had never valued the operational foundations of any business, believing that financial manipulation was the only real skill worth mastering. Perhaps cleaning bathrooms, changing linens, and unclogging drains would teach him what I had learned years ago: that excellence is built from the ground up, one unglamorous task at a time. As I stood in my penthouse office overlooking the city skyline, I wondered how tomorrow would unfold. Would Derek quit immediately upon discovering who signed his paychecks? Or would desperation force him to swallow his pride and accept the position? Either way, the journey that had brought me from that devastating text message to owning the Grand Azure had transformed me in ways Derek could never understand. Success wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving myself right. My phone buzzed with a message from Madison. He's still here, collected his uniform and employee handbook. Looks like he's actually going through with it. I smiled, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and promise. Interesting, I replied. Let's see if he shows up at 5:15 tomorrow. The real victory wasn't that Derek would be cleaning toilets in my hotel. It was that I had built something meaningful and lasting while he had destroyed everything he touched. That was a lesson worth far more than revenge. At 5:07 the next morning, I stood in the security monitoring room of the Grand Azure, watching the employee entrance through multiple camera angles. The pre-dawn darkness shrouded the staff parking area in shadows, broken only by the gentle glow of security lighting. Part of me expected Derek would never show, that his pride would overcome his financial desperation. But at precisely 5:13, his decade-old BMW pulled into the lot. The luxury car he'd once proudly maintained now showed signs of neglect. A dented fender, fading paint, and a cracked tail light told their own story of his downfall. For a long moment after parking, he simply sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, seemingly gathering courage for what lay ahead. "Didn't think he'd actually come," remarked Xavier, our head of security, watching the monitor beside me. "Necessity is a powerful motivator," I replied, observing as Derek finally emerged from his car in the ill-fitting maintenance uniform we'd provided, khaki pants and a blue polo with the Grand Azure logo prominently displayed. The clothing hung awkwardly on his frame, so different from the impeccably tailored suits that had once been his armor. "You want me to keep an eye on him specially?" Xavier asked. I shook my head. "No. Treat him exactly like any other employee. No special attention, good or bad." Derek stood straighter, adjusted his uniform, and walked toward the entrance, his body language transforming with each step. By the time he badged into the employee entrance at 5:14, he had assumed the confident stride and expression that had once carried him through corporate boardrooms. It was a masterclass in fake it till you make it, something I recognized from our marriage whenever he'd been promoted beyond his capabilities. "Show the housekeeping department," I instructed, and Xavier switched camera feeds to show the employee locker room where Raymond, our veteran executive housekeeper, was briefing the morning shift team. Raymond was a treasure, a 30-year hospitality veteran who had worked his way up from dishwasher to running the housekeeping operations of one of the finest hotels in the city. His salt and pepper hair and perpetually immaculate uniform commanded immediate respect, and his standards were legendarily high. Derek entered the room and stood awkwardly at the back as Raymond continued his briefing without acknowledging the new arrival. The contrast between Derek and the rest of the housekeeping staff was striking. Most were immigrants or from working-class backgrounds, people Derek would have previously overlooked entirely in his corporate life. "That's enough surveillance," I decided, turning away from the monitors. "I have a hotel to run." But as I walked toward my office, Xavier called after me. "Ms. Miller? He's already asking about management opportunities. Overheard him telling another new hire that he's only doing this temporarily until a more suitable position opens up." I smiled slightly. "Of course he is. Thank you, Xavier." The morning passed in a flurry of executive meetings and operational decisions. The Grand Azure never slept, and as CEO, my attention was constantly required on a dozen fronts. We were finalizing plans for a major renovation of the North Wing, negotiating with a renowned chef to take over our signature restaurant, and preparing for a citywide convention that would fill our rooms to capacity. I purposely avoided checking on Derek's progress, trusting Raymond to handle his training like any other new employee. This wasn't about micromanaging his humiliation. It was about allowing natural consequences to unfold without interference. Around noon, Madison appeared in my office doorway, an amused expression on her face. "So, our newest maintenance employee just had his first encounter with a clogged toilet in the grand ballroom. Apparently, someone flushed a cocktail napkin during this morning's business breakfast." I looked up from the spreadsheets I'd been reviewing. And how did he handle it? According to Raymond, he stood there for 5 minutes trying to explain why someone else should handle it, because he was overqualified for waste management tasks. Madison leaned against the doorframe. Raymond just stared at him until he finally picked up the plunger. And did he succeed? I asked, trying not to picture the scene too vividly. Eventually, after flooding half the bathroom floor and ruining his shoes, Raymond says his technique was the worst he's seen in 3 decades of hospitality service. I returned to my spreadsheets with a small nod. He'll improve with practice. If he lasts that long, Madison observed, housekeeping is betting. He won't make it through the week. Jorge started a pool. Current odds are 3-1 he quits by Friday. And what did you bet? That he'll last exactly until he figures out how to access his frozen assets or finds another job. Self-preservation will win over pride every time. The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Eliza Washington, one of our primary investors. She swept into my office unannounced, elegant as always in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than Derek's monthly salary. "Sophia, darling," she greeted me with the warmth that belied her formidable business reputation. "I'm in town for the Wilson merger and simply had to see the Grand Azure's transformation for myself. The lobby is magnificent. Those restored chandeliers are inspired." "Eliza, what a wonderful surprise," I replied, genuinely pleased to see her. "Let me give you the full tour." As we walked through the hotel, Eliza made astute observations about everything from the guest flow at reception to the subtle fragrance in the corridors. Her attention to detail rivaled my own, which was why her investment in Elevate Hospitality had been so valuable beyond the financial aspect. "The board is tremendously impressed with Q1 results," she mentioned as we entered. "The newly renovated spa area. The Grand Azure is performing beyond projections already. We're fortunate to have retained most of the original staff," I explained. "They brought institutional knowledge that's invaluable, and our systems gave them the support they needed to excel further." As we rounded a corner near the indoor pool, I spotted a maintenance worker on his knees, scrubbing grout between marble tiles. It took a moment to recognize Derek, his face flushed with exertion, sweat staining his uniform. He looked up briefly, his expression shifting from concentration to shock as he recognized me with Eliza. "New maintenance staff?" Eliza inquired, noticing my momentary distraction. "Yes," I replied smoothly, continuing our walk without breaking. Stride. "We believe in thorough training for all positions." Derek quickly lowered his head back to his task, vigorously attacking the grout as if his life depended on it. The man who once relegated such work to the help was now intimately acquainted with the physical reality of maintaining luxury. "Speaking of staff," Eliza continued, mercifully moving past the moment, "your employee satisfaction scores are remarkable for the industry. How have you managed that while implementing such significant operational changes?" As we completed the tour in the rooftop garden, Eliza turned to me with her characteristic directness. "You've created something extraordinary here, Sophia. The board is prepared to approve funding for the next acquisition whenever you're ready." "Actually," I admitted, "I've been considering a slightly different direction for our next move. What would you think about developing a property from the ground up instead of another acquisition?" Eliza's eyebrows rose with interest. "Bold. More risk, but potentially more reward. You have a specific location in mind, I assume." "The old Wellington waterfront property. It's been vacant for years, but the location is unparalleled. We could create something truly unique, a property that embodies Elevate's philosophy from foundation to rooftop." "Send me the prospectus," she said with a decisive nod. If it's as thoughtfully developed as everything else you've done, I suspect the board will be receptive. After Eliza departed, I found myself drawn to check on Derek's progress. I made my way to the housekeeping department under the pretense of reviewing the new linen inventory system. Raymond met me with his usual military precision, walking me through the storage areas while providing detailed updates. "And how are the new maintenance staff performing?" I asked casually as we finished our inspection. Raymond's expression remained professional, but a hint of amusement crept into his voice. "Most are progressing according to standard, Ms. Miller. We have one who's struggling with the adjustment." "Mr. Conway?" I clarified, using Derek's surname. "Yes. His work is adequate when he applies himself, but his attitude—" Raymond hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He seems to believe this position is beneath him. He keeps mentioning his executive background and asking when he can interview for management." "And what have you told him?" "The same thing I tell everyone. Master the basics first. Excellence in fundamental operations is the foundation of all advancement at the Grand Azure." Raymond recited our company philosophy with genuine conviction. He didn't seem to appreciate the advice. "Keep me updated on his progress," I requested. "Everyone deserves the opportunity to adapt and grow, regardless of their background." Raymond nodded, his eyes conveying that he understood the unique situation without needing details. "Of course, Ms. Miller. I believe he's assigned to the public restrooms on the mezzanine level this afternoon, if you'd like to observe his work directly." I thanked him and made my way to the mezzanine, taking a circuitous route through service corridors rarely seen by guests. The Grand Azure, like all great hotels, operated on two parallel planes: the front-of-house world of luxury and seamless service, and the back-of-house reality of hard work and operational precision. From a discreet vantage point, I observed Derek methodically cleaning the men's restroom, his movements mechanical and his expression distant. The careful precision he'd once applied to financial spreadsheets was now directed at polishing chrome, fixtures, and scrubbing urinals. There was something almost meditative in his focus, as if he'd temporarily surrendered to the task to escape the larger implications of his situation. A well-dressed business guest entered, barely acknowledging Derek's presence as he used the facilities and washed his hands. The casual invisibility of service staff, something Derek had perpetuated throughout his corporate career, was now his reality. The guest departed without a word, leaving water splashed across the counter for Derek to wipe up. I slipped away, before Derek emerged, strangely affected by the scene. This wasn't about humiliation or revenge, I reminded myself. It was about fundamental respect for all work and all workers, a lesson Derek had desperately needed to learn. That evening, as most of the executive team departed, I remained in my office reviewing architectural proposals for the Wellington waterfront project. The Grand Azure quieted as day guests departed and evening check-ins settled into their rooms. This transitional time, when the hotel's pulse slowed but never stopped, was often my most productive. A knock at my open door interrupted my concentration. Madison stood there, tablet in hand. "Derek Conway has requested a meeting with hotel management. He completed his first day and submitted the request through proper channels." I leaned back in my chair, considering the implications. "Interesting. What does Raymond say about his performance?" "Adequate. Not stellar, not terrible. He completed all assigned tasks, though several required correction. His knowledge of cleaning chemicals is dangerously limited. He nearly mixed ammonia and bleach in the guest laundry room. I winced at the potential disaster such a mixture could have caused. Has he been scheduled for proper OSHA training?" "Tomorrow morning at 5:30, Madison confirmed, before his regular shift. "And what do you think he wants from this meeting?" Madison smiled slightly. Based on comments he's made to other staff, he believes his executive experience qualifies him to bypass entry-level positions. He's been telling anyone who'll listen about his MBA and former CFO title. I considered my options carefully. Part of me wanted to decline the meeting request, forcing Derek to work through proper channels and hierarchy. But another part recognized that a direct conversation might serve a greater purpose. Schedule him for 7:30 tomorrow morning, I decided. After his safety training, but before his shift. And Madison, don't tell him who he'll be meeting with. The next morning, I arrived at the small conference room near the housekeeping offices at precisely 7:25. The room, utilitarian and functional, was a far cry from the elegant meeting spaces upstairs where Derek would have expected a management discussion to take place. I reviewed his personnel file while waiting, noting that Raymond had documented multiple instances of Derek attempting to delegate his assigned tasks to other maintenance workers, all of whom had politely but firmly declined. At 7:29, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," I called, not looking up from the file. Derek entered, visibly trying to mask his exhaustion. The OSHA training would have followed his first physically demanding workday in decades, and the strain showed in the dark circles under his eyes and his slightly stooped posture. Still, he'd made an effort to appear professional. His uniform was crisp and clean, his hair carefully combed. "Good morning," he began confidently, then faltered as he recognized me. "Sophia, I thought I was meeting with department management." "You are," I replied calmly, gesturing for him to sit. "As CEO, all departments ultimately report to me. I make it a point to be involved when employees request management meetings during their probationary period. It's unusual, but not unprecedented." Derek sat slowly, his rehearsed speech clearly derailed. "I appreciate you taking the time." "Of course. Your file indicates you completed your first day successfully. That's commendable. Many new employees find the physical demands challenging." He straightened slightly at the unexpected praise. "Yes, well, I've always been adaptable. In fact, that's partially why I requested this meeting. I believe my skills and background would be better utilized in a different capacity." "After one day?" I raised an eyebrow. "Most positions require at least 90 days to demonstrate proficiency." "My situation is somewhat unique," he countered, slipping into the persuasive tone he'd once used in boardrooms. "My executive experience, particularly in financial operations, could be an immediate asset to the hotel. While I appreciate the opportunity to learn the maintenance aspects, my MBA and 10 years as a CFO suggest a different placement would be more efficient for everyone." I looked at him thoughtfully, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. "Derek, do you know why every employee at the Grand Azure starts with fundamental operations, regardless of their background?" "I assume it's some kind of corporate philosophy about understanding the business from the ground up," he replied with barely concealed impatience. "Partially," I acknowledged. "But it's more than that. Excellence isn't an abstraction here. It's built through concrete actions repeated with intention and care. The person who can make a toilet gleam understands something essential about attention to detail that can't be taught in an MBA program." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "With all due respect, Sophia, we both know this placement is about our personal history. You have every right to be angry about how our marriage ended, but this isn't about our marriage," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "This is about understanding the true foundation of success. Throughout your career, you've valued financial manipulation over operational excellence. You believed moving numbers around on spreadsheets was inherently more valuable than creating actual quality." Derek's face flushed, That's not fair. Financial strategy is critical to any business. Of course it is, I agreed, but not at the expense of operational integrity, something Pinnacle Investments learned the hard way. Tell me, when was the last time you visited the operational level of any company you managed financially? When did you last speak with the people who actually created the value you tracked in your spreadsheets? He had no answer, and we both knew it. Your request for reassignment is denied, I continued professionally. Complete your 90-day probationary period in maintenance with acceptable performance evaluations, and then we can discuss potential advancement opportunities based on demonstrated skills and cultural fit. And if I refuse? He challenged, a hint of the old Derek emerging through his exhaustion. That's entirely your choice. The Grand Azure has a waiting list of qualified applicants for every position. No one is irreplaceable. Another lesson Pinnacle might have benefited from understanding. Derek's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining from him. So this is my punishment? Cleaning toilets indefinitely while you watch from your penthouse office? I stood, gathering his file. This isn't punishment, Derek. It's opportunity. One many would be grateful for given your circumstances. Every position at the Grand Azure is worthy of respect, including maintenance. The question isn't whether the job is beneath you, but whether you can rise to meet its actual requirements, not just its physical tasks, but the mindset of service excellence. I moved toward the door, then paused. Your shift begins in 20 minutes. Raymond mentioned you'll be deep cleaning the spa whirlpools today. Apparently, there was an incident with a guest's fake tan that requires special attention. As I left, I caught a glimpse of Derek's face, a complex mixture of anger, resignation, and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of understanding. Back in my office, I found myself reflecting on our conversation. Was I being too harsh? Or not harsh? Enough? The line between justified consequence and vindictive punishment felt suddenly blurry. I picked up the framed mission statement that sat on my desk, the same one that hung in every employee area of every Elevate hospitality property. Excellence isn't an achievement, it's a continuous practice. Every role matters, every detail counts, every guest remembers. These weren't just corporate platitudes to me. They were principles I'd built my success upon after losing everything. The question wasn't whether Derek deserved this lesson, but whether he would actually learn from it, whether the experience of maintaining luxury, rather than just consuming it, would transform his understanding of value and contribution. Only time would tell. And in the meantime, I had a hotel empire to run and a new development to plan. Endeavors far more worthy of my energy than monitoring my ex-husband's journey through the housekeeping department. The Wellington waterfront project would be my legacy, not this unexpected reunion. With that thought firmly in mind, I turned my attention to the architectural plans spread across my desk, focusing on creating something new rather than dwelling on the past. 2 weeks into Derek's employment at the Grand Azure, I found myself reviewing the daily operations reports in my office when Madison appeared with our morning coffee ritual. The steam rose from the artisanal ceramic mugs, a small luxury I'd instituted when we first acquired the hotel. Small moments of excellence, consistently delivered, formed the backbone of our brand philosophy. The Wellington waterfront proposal goes before the City Planning Commission tomorrow, Madison remarked, settling into the chair across from my desk. Victor says we have 7 of the 9 votes secured. And the other 2? I asked, sipping the perfectly prepared latte. On the fence. They're concerned about parking infrastructure and beach access for residents. Nothing we can't address with the revised plans. I nodded, making a mental note to review those sections before tomorrow's presentation. The Wellington project represented Our group's first ground-up development, a significant evolution in our business model and a personal milestone in my journey. How's our special maintenance employee progressing? I asked, changing the subject. Madison's expression shifted to amusement. Surprisingly, he's still here. Raymond says his performance has improved from barely adequate to acceptably mediocre. He stopped talking about his executive background quite so much, though he did try to give housekeeping investment advice on their 401ks during lunch break yesterday. I couldn't help but smile at the image. At least he's attempting to contribute value. There was an incident this morning, Madison continued, her tone shifting slightly. A guest in the presidential suite had some digestive distress. The bathroom required extensive cleaning. Derek was assigned to handle it. And he did it without complaint or attempts to delegate. Raymond said it was the first time he seemed to fully accept his current position, rather than viewing it as temporary humiliation. I set down my coffee, genuinely surprised. That's unexpected progress. There's more, Madison added. After he finished, the guest, Mrs. Whitmore, that tech CEO from Seattle, stopped him in the hallway. Apparently, she recognized him from a business conference last year where he'd been a featured speaker on corporate finance. She was rather loud about it, asking what happened to him while several other guests were present. I winced, imagining the scene. Public humiliation had never been my intention for Derek. Genuine understanding had. How did he handle it? I asked. According to the hall attendant who overheard, he simply said, "Life takes unexpected turns. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm learning valuable lessons about real work." Then he excused himself and went back to his duties. A complicated emotion settled in my chest. Not quite sympathy, but a certain respect for dignity maintained under difficult circumstances. "Would you like me to intervene?" Madison asked, watching my expression carefully. "We could move him to back-of-house duties where he's less likely to encounter former colleagues." I considered the question thoughtfully. No. Part of valuable work is handling difficult interpersonal situations with grace. It seems he's learning that lesson already. Later that afternoon, while touring the property with our facilities director to discuss the upcoming renovation of the North Wing, I glimpsed Derek meticulously cleaning the ornate lobby chandelier. Perched on a tall ladder, he was carefully wiping each crystal piece by piece, a tedious task requiring patience and attention to detail. What struck me wasn't the activity itself, but his approach. 2 weeks ago, he would have rushed through the task, viewing it as beneath him. Now, he was fully absorbed in doing it properly, his focus complete and his movements deliberate. There was something almost meditative in his careful work, the same intense concentration I'd once observed when he tackled complex financial problems. The maintenance staff drew straws for chandelier duty, the facilities director commented, following my gaze. Usually nobody wants it. Too tedious and exacting. Conway volunteered. Did he say why? I asked, genuinely curious. Said something about appreciating the engineering of the fixture. He's been reading the original architectural plans for the building during his breaks. Seems genuinely interested in how the hotel was constructed. We continued our tour, but the image of Derek carefully tending to each crystal stayed with me. Perhaps the lesson was taking root in ways I hadn't anticipated. The next evening, after successfully presenting the Wellington waterfront project to the Planning Commission and receiving preliminary approval, I returned to the Grand Azure, energized but exhausted. The project that would become Elevate Hospitality's crown jewel was finally moving from concept to reality. As I crossed the lobby toward the executive elevator, the concierge called out to me, "Ms. Miller, There's a small situation in the Sapphire Lounge that might benefit from your attention. Something serious? I asked, switching instantly into problem-solving mode. Not exactly, but delicate. It involves Mr. Conway and some hotel guests. I changed direction immediately, heading toward our upscale lobby bar. The Sapphire Lounge was one of the Grand Azure's most elegant spaces. All deep blues, polished woods, and subtle lighting designed to flatter every guest. At this hour, it was typically filled with business travelers unwinding after meetings or couples enjoying pre-dinner cocktails. As I approached, I heard laughter. Not the pleasant ambient kind, but the sharp, targeted variety that immediately put me on alert. Through the entryway, I saw Derek in his maintenance uniform, mop in hand, cleaning a spill near the bar. Around him stood 3 men in expensive suits, cocktails in hand, openly mocking him. "Conway, from CFO to cleaning crew. Now that's what I call a career transition," one was saying loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Pinnacle's finest financial mind, now an expert in toilet bowls instead of stock portfolios," added another, triggering more derisive laughter. I recognized them immediately, financial executives from competing firms who had undoubtedly crossed paths with Derek during his Pinnacle career. The cruel delight they took in his downfall was written across their faces. Derek continued mopping, his expression carefully neutral, though the tightness in his shoulders revealed his discomfort. He had almost finished when one of the men, accidentally, knocked over another drink, creating a fresh spill. "Oops," the man said with exaggerated innocence. "Looks like you missed a spot, Conway." Something hardened in me at the deliberate cruelty of the gesture. This wasn't the natural consequence I'd intended for Derek. This was simple bullying, something the Grand Azure would never tolerate toward any staff member. I stepped forward, making my presence known. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority I'd developed over years of hotel management. "Is there a problem here?" The men turned, taking in my tailored suit and confident stance, clearly trying to place me in the hotel hierarchy. "No problem," the ringleader replied smoothly. "Just catching up with an old colleague who's fallen on hard times. Quite the spectacular fall, wouldn't you say?" "What I see," I replied evenly, "is a dedicated Grand Azure employee being harassed while performing his duties. That's something we take very seriously." Derek looked up, surprise crossing his features as he recognized me stepping into the situation. "We're paying customers having a drink," one of the men protested. "And just having a bit of fun with Conway here. No harm intended." "I'm afraid your idea of fun conflicts with our standards of conduct toward staff," I signaled discreetly to Xavier, our security director, who had materialized nearby at the first sign of potential trouble. "Mr. Xavier will escort you to the front desk where you'll find your bills have been settled. The Grand Azure thanks you for your understanding that we must ask you to continue your evening elsewhere." The men's expressions shifted from amusement to disbelief. "You're throwing us out? Do you have any idea who we are?" demanded the ringleader. "Gentlemen who are unfortunately no longer welcome at the Grand Azure," I replied with professional firmness. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who creates an uncomfortable environment for our staff or guests." Xavier stepped forward. "This way, gentlemen." After a moment of tension, the men recognized the futility of arguing and allowed themselves to be escorted out, throwing final glares at both Derek and myself. When they had gone, Derek straightened up, his expression complicated. "You didn't need to do that." "Actually, I did," I corrected him. "The Grand Azure protects all its employees, regardless of position or background. That policy exists for everyone from housekeepers to executives. Even ex-husbands who treated you terribly? He asked quietly. Even them, I confirmed. Dignity in work is a core value here, not an empty slogan. Derek finished cleaning the spill in silence, while I ensured the disruption hadn't bothered other guests. As he prepared to leave with his cleaning supplies, he hesitated. Thank you, he said simply. Not just for that, but for... He gestured vaguely, seeming to encompass his entire situation. For the lesson. I'm starting to understand what you've been trying to show me. With that, he nodded respectfully and returned to his duties, leaving me with the distinct feeling that something had fundamentally shifted between us. The following week brought the most significant gala of the season to the Grand Azure, the Children's Hospital Foundation benefit, an event that filled our ballrooms with the city's elite and raised millions for pediatric medical care. As CEO of the host venue, I would be prominently involved, meaning my paths would inevitably cross with Derek's maintenance duties. The morning of the gala, I convened the all-staff briefing that preceded every major event. Hundreds of employees gathered in the grand ballroom as department heads outlined the evening's logistics and special requirements. From the podium, I noticed Derek standing with the maintenance team, attentive and engaged in a way he hadn't been during his first days. Excellence isn't just for the guests who arrive in limousines, I reminded the assembled staff. It's for every person who walks through our doors seeking the unique experience only the Grand Azure can provide. Tonight, we have the privilege of supporting a cause that saves children's lives while showcasing the exceptional standards that define us. I continued with specific acknowledgments of departments that had gone above and beyond in preparation, including housekeeping and maintenance, whose overnight teams had transformed the ballrooms after a corporate conference had departed only 12 hours earlier. Your work makes miracles possible, I concluded. Both the medical miracles this gala will fund and the small daily miracles of human connection that happen when people feel truly valued. As the staff dispersed to their stations, I noticed Derek lingering near the back of the room, a thoughtful expression on his face. Our eyes met briefly across the emptying ballroom before he turned to join his team, but something in that fleeting connection suggested he'd truly heard my message about the dignity and impact of service work. Hours later, as the gala reached its peak, I circulated among donors and hospital administrators, playing my role as host and facilitator. The evening was proceeding flawlessly. The Grand Azure's service standards on full display, as staff anticipated needs before they were expressed, and solved minor issues before they became noticeable problems. During a quiet moment between conversations, I stepped onto the terrace for a brief respite from the crowded ballroom. The night air was cool and refreshing, the city lights spread below like earthbound stars. I was surprised to find Derek there, not in his maintenance uniform but wearing a standard server's attire. I volunteered to help with past hors d'oeuvres when Carlos called in sick, he explained, noticing my questioning look. Raymond approved the temporary reassignment. That's, I searched for the right word, commendable, taking initiative. To fill a need. Derek shrugged slightly. It seemed like the right thing to do. The event's importance to the hotel was clear from your briefing this morning. We stood in surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment, both looking out over the city skyline. You've built something remarkable, Derek said finally. Not just the hotel, but the entire operation. The way everything fits together, every person knowing their role in creating the overall experience. It's impressive. Thank you, I replied, genuinely touched by the observation. It's been a journey. I've been thinking a lot these past weeks, he continued, his voice reflective. About value, about what work really matters. When I was at Pinnacle, I genuinely believed the financial layer was the most important part of any business, that people like me created value while operations just happened. He gestured toward the ballroom behind us. But watching how this place functions, how every role connects to every other, how the smallest details combine to create something extraordinary, it's humbling. I was wrong about so many things. The admission hung in the air between us, encompassing far more than business philosophy. "Your Wellington waterfront project," he said, changing the subject slightly. "The plans are on display in the employee break room. It's brilliant, the way you're integrating the historical elements while creating something entirely new." I raised an eyebrow, surprised by his knowledge of the project. "You've studied the plans?" "During lunch breaks," he admitted. "The financing structure is particularly elegant, leveraging the waterfront premium while keeping the development accessible to a broader market than typical luxury properties." It was exactly the balance I'd fought to achieve against some investor skepticism, maximizing return while remaining true to Elevate Hospitality's mission of accessible excellence. "That aspect wasn't in the public plans," I noted. "You've been doing more research than just break room browsing." Derek smiled slightly, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since he began working at the Grand Azure. Once a financial analyst, always a financial analyst. I asked Madison for the public investor prospectus. She was reluctant, but eventually provided it. Before I could respond, Xavier appeared at the terrace doorway. "Ms. Miller, they're preparing for the donation announcement. Your presence is requested on stage." "Of course," I acknowledged, then turned back to Derek. "Duty calls." "As it should," he replied with unexpected sincerity. "What you're doing here tonight matters. It always did, even when I was too blind to see it." As I rejoined the gala, I found myself reflecting on our conversation. The Derek I'd known during our marriage would never have acknowledged being wrong, let alone expressed genuine admiration for someone else's accomplishments. Perhaps the lessons of the past month ran deeper than I'd anticipated. The next morning, still riding the success of the gala, which had raised a record $3 million for the Children's Hospital, I arrived at my office to find Raymond waiting with an unusual request. "Mr. Conway has submitted a formal proposal," he explained, handing me a professionally prepared document. "He's requesting permission to develop an efficiency initiative for the maintenance department." I took the proposal with surprise, scanning the executive summary. Derek had identified several inefficiencies in maintenance operations, particularly in inventory management and work order processing. His proposal outlined a streamlined system that would reduce supply costs while improving response times to maintenance requests. "He developed this during his personal time," Raymond explained. "Stayed after shifts to analyze our current systems and research alternatives. The math checks out. We could reduce department expenses by nearly 18% while improving service metrics." "What do you think of it?" I asked, genuinely interested in Raymond's assessment. "It's solid," the veteran housekeeper admitted. "Shows a level of respect for our operations I wouldn't have expected given his background. He actually consulted with the staff who do the daily work, incorporated their practical knowledge into his recommendations." That detail caught my attention. The Derek who had dismissed my career aspirations would never have sought input from maintenance workers he considered beneath him. Something had genuinely shifted in his perspective. "Has he requested reassignment along with this proposal?" I asked, expecting that the initiative was his way of angling for a management position. "That's the surprising part," Raymond replied. "He specifically noted he's not seeking reassignment or special treatment. He just believes the improvements would benefit the hotel and wanted to contribute." I studied the proposal more carefully, noting the thorough research and thoughtful implementation plan. Tell him his initiative is approved for a 60-day trial. He can coordinate implementation with you while maintaining his regular duties. After Raymond departed, I sat with the proposal, turning over this new development in my mind. Derek, contributing. Value without seeking personal advancement represented a fundamental shift in his approach to work and hierarchy. Exactly the transformation I'd hoped might be possible, but hadn't truly expected. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Eliza Washington. "Sophia, darling, I've just had the most interesting lunch with Garrett Stevens from First Capital Partners." My attention sharpened immediately. First Capital was one of the city's premier investment firms, and Garrett Stevens their notoriously selective managing partner. "Stevens is looking for hospitality investment opportunities," Eliza continued, "and was particularly interested when I mentioned the Wellington waterfront project. He'd like to meet with you, tomorrow if possible." First Capital's involvement would solve our remaining financing challenges for Wellington and potentially provide capital for future expansions. It was an opportunity we couldn't afford to miss. "I'll make myself available whenever works for him," I assured her. "Excellent. He mentioned something odd, though," Eliza added. "He asked if you still had Derek Conway on your team. Seemed to think he was working with you in some financial capacity." I froze, momentarily confused. "That's strange. Derek is employed here, but not in finance." Did Stevens elaborate? Only that he and Derek had worked together years ago, and he'd heard through the grapevine that Derek was now at the Grand Azure. I didn't correct his assumption about Derek's role, as I wasn't certain of the details myself. After ending the call, I sat pondering this bizarre connection. How did Garrett Stevens know Derek was working here? And why would that fact interest him regarding the Wellington project? The answer came later that evening when I encountered Derek performing his closing maintenance checks in the lobby. I approached him directly, setting aside our usual careful distance. "Derek, do you know Garrett Stevens from First Capital Partners?" He looked surprised by the question, but nodded. "We worked together at Pearson & White before I joined Pinnacle. He was a junior partner then. I was a financial analyst. Why?" "He's expressed interest in the Wellington waterfront project and specifically asked if you were still on my team." Understanding dawned in Derek's eyes. "Ah, that would be because of the Harborview development." "The what?" "A mixed-use project in Baltimore that Garrett and I structured together. Very similar to your Wellington concept. Historical waterfront. Property repurposed with both hospitality and residential components. It was highly successful, won several urban development awards." I processed this information, seeing potential opportunity and complication simultaneously. "Stevens believes you're working in a financial capacity here." Derek had the grace to look embarrassed. "I may have implied as much when I ran into him at the coffee shop across the street last week. Not explicitly, but I didn't correct his assumption either. Professional pride, I suppose." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The ex-husband I'd relegated to cleaning toilets might now be instrumental in securing critical financing for my most ambitious project, but only if we maintained the illusion that he held a position worthy of his former status. "Eliza has arranged a meeting with Stevens tomorrow to discuss Wellington. He's expecting you to be there in some financial advisory capacity." Derek considered the implications carefully. "What do you want me to do?" It was a simple question that acknowledged the complexity of our situation with surprising humility. The Derek who had walked into the Grand Azure a month ago would have leveraged this opportunity to demand promotion or special treatment. This Derek simply asked how he could help. "I need you to be there," I admitted. If your connection with Stevens helps secure financing for Wellington, that benefits everyone at Elevate Hospitality, including the maintenance staff. And my role? He asked cautiously. I made a decision then that surprised even me. Special. Financial consultant to the Wellington project, a temporary assignment in addition to your regular duties. You can review the complete financials tonight and attend the meeting tomorrow in a consultant capacity. Relief and something like gratitude crossed his features. Thank you for the opportunity. I won't let you down. See that you don't, I replied, but without the edge that would have accompanied those words a month ago. This project matters to me, Derek. It's not just another hotel. It's the first property that will be entirely ours from the ground up. I understand, he said quietly, and I'll help you make it happen, whatever role that requires, even if I'm back cleaning toilets the next day. As we stood in the quiet grandeur of the empty lobby, surrounded by the legacy of the Grand Azure and the promise of Wellington's future, I realized we had both traveled further than the distance between penthouse and maintenance department. The journey from who we had been to who we were becoming was measured not in floors and titles, but in understanding and growth. The morning of the Garrett Stevens meeting dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day that seemed to reflect my cautious optimism about the Wellington project's prospects. As I dressed in my most impeccable suit, a subtle armor for high-stakes negotiations, I found myself contemplating the strange turn of events that had brought Derek and me to this unlikely collaboration. By 9:15, I was reviewing the financial presentation in the Grand Azure's executive conference room when Derek arrived, looking transformed. Gone was the maintenance uniform, replaced by a borrowed suit from our lost and found collection that had been expertly tailored overnight by our alterations department. His hair was freshly cut, his posture erect with a confidence that seemed more authentic than the bravado he'd displayed during his first days at the hotel. Raymond approved the temporary uniform change, he explained, straightening his borrowed tie. Though he made it very clear I'm expected back in maintenance blues immediately after the meeting. I nodded, appreciating Raymond's boundary setting. You've reviewed the full financials? Until 2 a.m., Derek confirmed, placing a folder of neatly annotated projections on the table. Your basic structure is extremely sound. I've made some minor suggestions that might strengthen our position with First Capital, particularly regarding the phase development approach. I raised an eyebrow at the "our position" phrasing but didn't correct him. For today, at least, our interests were perfectly aligned. Show me, I requested, and we spent the next 30 minutes in focused discussion of capital expenditure timelines and return projections. Despite everything in our personal history, I found myself impressed with Derek's financial acumen. He'd identified several opportunities to strengthen the proposal that my team and I had overlooked. This sequencing creates better cash flow during the construction phases, he explained, pointing to his revised timeline. It reduces the total capital needed up front without compromising the design integrity or delaying the ultimate completion date. The approach was elegant, addressing exactly the concerns that had made some potential investors hesitant. I found myself nodding with genuine appreciation. It's good work, I acknowledged. Very good, actually. A ghost of his old smile appeared. Some skills don't disappear, even when you've lost everything else. Before I could respond, Madison appeared at the door. Garrett Stevens and Eliza have arrived. They're in the lobby. I gathered my materials, suddenly aware of the strange dynamics at play. For the next hour, Derek would step back into something resembling his old life, respected, listened to, treated as an equal in the world of high finance. And then, when the meeting concluded, he would return to unclogging drains and polishing fixtures. Ready? I asked. As I'll ever be, he replied. a complex emotion crossing his features. Sophia, regardless of how this goes, thank you for this opportunity. I know you didn't have to include me. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. Let's just focus on getting Wellington funded, I said, more brusquely than intended, uncomfortable with this new version of Derek who expressed genuine gratitude instead of entitlement. Garrett Stevens proved to be exactly as advertised, sharp, direct, and intimidatingly perceptive. Within minutes of our introductions in the penthouse conference room, he was drilling into the details of the Wellington proposal with laser-like precision. Your projected occupancy rates seem optimistic for the first 18 months, he noted, studying our forecasts. What's your contingency if the ramp-up is slower than anticipated? Before I could respond, Derek smoothly interjected. We've actually built significant buffers into the operating capital structure. He flipped to a detailed cash flow analysis. Even at 65% of projected occupancy, the property remains cash positive through all phases. Stevens nodded appreciatively. Smart. Most developers overestimate early performance and underestimate capital needs. He looked between Derek and me with interest. You two make a formidable team. Conway always had an exceptional grasp of risk management. Derek has been instrumental in refining our approach, I acknowledged truthfully. His perspective has been illuminating. The meeting progressed remarkably well. Stevens was clearly impressed with both the concept and financial structure of the Wellington project. Derek's contributions were substantive and precise, demonstrating a depth of financial expertise that even I had underestimated. He never overstepped or tried to dominate the conversation, instead providing support and clarification that enhanced my presentation. I'm impressed, Stevens declared as we wrapped up. First Capital is definitely interested in participating. Our investment committee meets next Thursday. I'd like to present this to them then. We'd be delighted, I replied, barely containing my excitement. First Capital's involvement would virtually guarantee Wellington's success and establish Elevate Hospitality as a serious player in luxury property development. One more thing, Stevens added, gathering his materials. Conway, are you exclusive? With Elevate Hospitality? We've been looking for someone with your specific expertise for our hospitality investment division. Your work on this proposal reminds me why we worked so well together at Pearson & White. The offer hung in the air like a perfectly tossed lifeline to a drowning man. Here was Derek's opportunity to escape maintenance work, to return to the financial world he'd once dominated, a world that still valued his skills despite Pinnacle's collapse. Derek hesitated, his expression unreadable. I'm currently committed to the Grand Azure, he said carefully. But I appreciate the consideration. Stevens seemed surprised but didn't press the issue. Well, keep it in mind, my offer stands. We should wrap up the Wellington details over dinner soon. The Capitol Grill, perhaps? After Eliza and Stevens departed, promising next steps and continued interest, Derek and I found ourselves alone in the conference room. The energy of the successful meeting still hummed between us, a shared accomplishment that transcended our complicated history. That went well, I observed, gathering the presentation materials. Your contributions were significant. The Wellington concept sells itself, Derek replied modestly. It's truly visionary, exactly what that waterfront has needed for decades. Stevens seemed quite interested in recruiting you, I noted, watching his reaction carefully. Derek shrugged slightly. A week ago, I would have jumped at the opportunity. And now? He considered the question thoughtfully. Now I understand there's something valuable about working your way from the foundation up. I haven't earned the right to jump back into a corner office. Not yet. The insight surprised me with its authenticity. That's unexpectedly self-aware. A small smile crossed his features. Cleaning toilets provides ample time for reflection. Besides, there's a certain satisfaction in physical work that I never experienced in finance, seeing immediate, tangible results of your efforts. I studied him, trying to reconcile this thoughtful, humble man with the arrogant executive who had dismissed my career and dreams years earlier. You've changed. Had to, he admitted. When everything you've built collapses and you're forced to start over, you either learn and grow or you break entirely. He checked his watch. Speaking of which, I'm due back in maintenance in 20 minutes. Raymond doesn't appreciate tardiness, even for executive meetings. As he turned to leave, I made an impulsive decision. Derek, wait. I'd like to discuss a modified arrangement. He paused, clearly expecting the worst. I understand. If my presence is complicating things with Stevens or creating awkwardness for the staff. Actually, I interrupted, I'd like to propose a dual role. You'll continue your maintenance position 3 days a week, completing your full 90-day probationary period as originally planned. The other 2 days, you'll work as a special financial consultant on the Wellington project, helping us prepare for the investment committee and subsequent development phases. His expression shifted from resignation to cautious hope. You're serious? The work you did on the financial structure is genuinely valuable, I acknowledged. It would be poor business judgment to ignore that talent when we need it most. But I held up a hand before he could respond. This doesn't mean bypassing the lessons of starting from the foundation. Both roles matter to the success of Elevate Hospitality. Derek nodded slowly, understanding. Both the financial analysis and the clean toilets contribute value in different ways. I accept. Thank you for the opportunity. As he left to change back into his maintenance uniform, I wondered if I'd made the right decision. Was I allowing genuine business needs to guide my choices, or was something more complicated at play in my willingness to bring Derek partially back into the professional sphere? The answer became clearer over the following weeks as Derek's dual role evolved. In maintenance, he continued to approach each task with newfound humility and thoroughness, earning increased respect from co-workers who had initially been skeptical of the former executive in their midst. Raymond reported that he never leveraged his new financial duties to avoid unpleasant tasks or seek special treatment. In his Wellington project work, Derek brought exceptional financial insight without the arrogance that had once characterized his approach. He worked collaboratively with our development team, genuinely listening to operational experts and incorporating their practical knowledge into financial models. First Capital's investment committee approved their participation in Wellington with unprecedented enthusiasm. Garrett Stevens personally called to confirm their commitment and suggest expanded opportunities for future collaborations. The long-dreamed property was becoming reality, with groundbreaking scheduled for fall. 6 weeks into this arrangement, I found myself working late in my office, reviewing updated designs for Wellington's signature restaurant space. A knock at my open door revealed Derek, still in his maintenance uniform but holding a folder of financial projections. Sorry to interrupt, he began. I've completed the operational expense analysis you requested, but I can come back tomorrow during my consultant hours if you prefer. No, now is fine. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. I was just reviewing the restaurant designs. He sat, handing me the folder before glancing at the architectural renderings spread across my desk. The indoor-outdoor flow is impressive. It reminds me of that cafe in Barcelona we visited during our anniversary trip. The reference to our shared past might once have created immediate tension, but something had shifted between us. The memories no longer carried the same sting of betrayal and disappointment. That was my inspiration, actually, I admitted. The way they blurred the boundary between interior and exterior space while maintaining intimacy. Derek nodded appreciatively. You always had an eye for spaces that create experiences. I should have recognized that talent when you were designing our home. The acknowledgement, so simple yet so profound, addressed one of the core wounds of our marriage. My design ambitions had always been treated as decorative hobbies rather than legitimate professional skills. Better late than never, I suppose, I replied, but without bitterness. He smiled slightly before turning to the expense projections, walking me through his analysis with clear expertise. We worked together for nearly an hour, finding unexpected common ground in the balance of luxury experience and financial sustainability that Wellington represented. As our meeting concluded, Derek gathered his notes and stood to leave. I should let you get back to the designs. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this project, Sophia. It means more than you know. Your work has been valuable, I acknowledged honestly, both in finance and in maintenance. He paused at the door. I've been meaning to ask. The charity gala for children's literacy next month. Raymond mentioned all staff are encouraged to volunteer. Would it be inappropriate for me to sign up given my complicated status? The question revealed his continued journey toward understanding true service. Not at all. In fact, I think it would be excellent experience, though I should warn you, volunteer duties can include everything from coat check to bathroom attendant. I've become quite skilled with bathroom maintenance, he replied with surprising good humor. It might actually be my comparative advantage. As he left, I realized that our interaction had contained none of the tension, resentment, or power dynamics that had defined our early encounters at the Grand Azure. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in Derek, but in me as well. The need to prove his insignificance or exert control over his circumstances had gradually dissolved as he demonstrated genuine change. The following week brought an unexpected development. Eliza requested an urgent meeting, arriving at my office, with uncharacteristic agitation. The SEC has expanded their investigation into Pinnacle investments, she announced without preamble. They're now reviewing all major client relationships from the past 5 years. My thoughts immediately went to Derek. How does this affect us? Potentially significantly, she replied, pacing the office. Conway's employment here, particularly his involvement with Wellington financing, could create the appearance of impropriety if the SEC decides to look closely. First Capital's involvement might be scrutinized given Stevens's previous connection to Conway. But Derek had nothing to do with our relationship with First Capital initially, I protested. And his consulting role began after Stevens approached us. Facts matter less than perception in these situations, Eliza countered. The board is concerned about potential reputational damage. They're suggesting we terminate Conway's employment immediately and distance ourselves completely from any association with him. The proposal struck me as both unnecessary and unjust. Derek has been an exemplary employee in both his roles. He's contributed significant value to Wellington without any hint of impropriety. This isn't about his performance, Eliza clarified. It's about protecting Elevate Hospitality from being dragged into Pinnacle's legal issues. The simplest solution is complete separation. I found myself instinctively resistant to this course of action. I need time to consider alternatives. There must be a more nuanced approach that protects the company without unjustly punishing someone who's worked hard to rebuild. Eliza studied me with sudden insight. Sophia, is there something more happening between you and Conway? Your defense seems personal. Nothing romantic, if that's what you're implying, I responded, firmly. But yes, it's become personal in a different way. I've witnessed a genuine transformation that deserves recognition, not punishment for associations he can't control. After Eliza departed, I sat contemplating the complex situation. The prudent business decision would be to follow the board's recommendation and terminate Derek's employment immediately. Yet something in me rebelled against this clinical solution that ignored the human growth I'd witnessed. I was still considering options when Madison appeared with news that complicated matters further. "Melanie Conway is in the lobby," she announced. "Derek's ex-wife. She's asking to see him, says it's urgent." The woman who had been Derek's executive assistant, then wife, now ex, wanted to see him at his maintenance job. The complexity of the situation was almost poetic. "Does he know she's here?" I asked. "Not yet. I thought you might want to handle this personally given the SEC situation Eliza mentioned." I considered for a moment. "Have her escorted to the small conference room near my office. I'll speak with her first, then determine whether to involve Derek." Melanie Conway was still strikingly beautiful, though stress had etched lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. She wore designer clothing that looked relatively new, suggesting she hadn't suffered the same financial collapse as Derek. "Mrs. Conway," I greeted her professionally, "I'm Sophia Miller, CEO of Elevate Hospitality. I understand you're looking for Derek." Her surprise at my identity was evident. You're Derek's ex-wife? The one he left for?" She trailed off, realizing the awkwardness of completing that sentence. "For you," I finished simply. "Yes, life takes interesting turns." She had the grace to look embarrassed. "I never expected to meet you, especially not like this. When I heard Derek was working maintenance at the Grand Azure, I assumed it was just another hotel. What can I help you with today?" I asked, steering the conversation back to her purpose. "I need to speak with Derek urgently. The SEC has offered him a cooperation agreement that could potentially unfreeze some of his assets and limit his legal exposure, but he needs to respond within 48 hours. The news was significant, exactly the lifeline Derek needed to begin rebuilding his financial life. That sounds like positive news. Why deliver it personally rather than through his lawyer? Melanie's composure faltered slightly. "Because part of the agreement involves testifying against former colleagues, including people who were once friends. I thought he might need support making that decision." I studied her with new interest. "That's surprisingly considerate given your divorce." "Our marriage ended badly," she admitted. "But before that, we were partners. What happened at Pinnacle wasn't Derek's fault. He was kept in the dark about the worst of it until it was too close. He deserves a second chance." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here was the woman who had participated in destroying my marriage, now advocating for the second chance I had already begun providing to Derek. "I'll have him brought to this conference room," I decided. "You can speak privately." As I arranged for Derek to be notified, I reflected on how dramatically circumstances had evolved. The man who had once seemed my nemesis was now someone I found myself wanting to protect and support in his continued growth. Later that evening, after Melanie had departed and Derek had returned to his maintenance duties, he sought me out in my office. "Melanie told me you arranged their meeting," he said, standing in the doorway. "Thank you for that courtesy." "The SEC cooperation agreement sounds promising," I observed. He nodded. "It is. A path forward, legally and financially." He hesitated before continuing. "I also heard about the board's concerns regarding my employment here. News traveled fast in the hotel industry. Eliza shouldn't have discussed that with you directly." "She didn't. Garrett Stevens mentioned it when he called to warn me about the expanded investigation." Derek entered the office fully, his expression resolute. "I want you to know I've decided to resign from both positions." The last thing I want is to create complications for Elevate Hospitality or Wellington after everything you've built. His willingness to sacrifice his own interests for the company's well-being represented perhaps the most profound evidence of his transformation. The Derek I had married would never have put anyone else's needs above his own career prospects. "I appreciate the gesture," I said carefully, "but I'm not convinced it's necessary. We're exploring alternatives that protect the company while recognizing your contributions." "Sophia," he replied gently, "we both know the simplest solution is for me to step away completely. The Wellington project is too important to risk any complications. I've drafted a formal resignation effective immediately." He placed an envelope on my desk, then added another folder beside it. "I've also completed comprehensive documentation of all my financial work on Wellington. Everything is organized for a smooth transition to whoever takes over." The thoroughness and consideration demonstrated in his actions touched me unexpectedly. This wasn't the entitled executive demanding special treatment, nor the broken man who'd first arrived in maintenance. This was someone who had genuinely learned the lessons I'd hoped the Grand Azure would teach. "What will you do?" I asked, not yet touching the resignation letter. "The SEC agreement, if finalized, allows me to work in financial advisory roles, with certain restrictions. Stevens has offered a position at First Capital specifically structured to comply with those limitations." He smiled slightly. "And if that doesn't work out, I've developed quite a skill set in luxury hotel maintenance." The joke carried a profound truth. He now valued all forms of work in ways he never had before. "Before you decide," I said, making a spontaneous decision, "I'd like you to consider one more option." I outlined an alternative that had been forming in my mind. A special advisory role with Elevate Hospitality that would be clearly structured to address the SEC's concerns while utilizing Derek's financial expertise. The position would include continued regular work in hotel operations to maintain his connection to the foundation of our business. "To be clear," I emphasized, "this isn't about our personal history or guilt or making amends. It's a business decision based on your demonstrated value and the unique perspective you've gained through your journey here." Derek listened thoughtfully. "Why would you take this risk for me after everything that happened between us?" "Because," I replied with sudden clarity, "the Grand Azure isn't just about luxury hospitality. It's about transformation, about becoming more than you were when you arrived. You've embodied that journey in ways I never anticipated." I gestured to the envelope containing his resignation. "Think about the alternative before making your final decision. Whatever you choose, the lessons you've learned here will serve you well." As Derek left to consider his options, I turned to the window overlooking the city that had witnessed both our downfalls and our resurrections. The journey from that devastating text message 4 years ago to this moment of unexpected grace had transformed us both in ways neither could have predicted. The woman who had sought revenge by making her ex-husband clean toilets had discovered something far more powerful than retribution: the capacity to recognize genuine growth and respond with earned opportunity rather than perpetual punishment. And the man who had dismissed his wife's ambitions had learned that real value comes not from status or titles, but from the dignity of work well done, regardless of whether that work involves financial analysis or bathroom maintenance. The Wellington waterfront project would soon break ground. Physical proof that dreams dismissed could rise stronger than ever. But the real transformation had occurred in human hearts and minds, in the understanding that no role is beneath us, no task unworthy of our best efforts, and no person incapable of meaningful change when given both accountability and opportunity. That, I realized, was the true success story. Not the 5-star hotel empire or the innovative waterfront development, but the growth that happens when we're stripped of pretense and forced to rebuild from the foundation up. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.